Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time machine. Not the cool sleek kind with buttons and a leather seat, but the kind that drops you face first into a decade where your doctor might prescribe cigarettes, your neighbour could legally sterilise you, and the nicest thing anyone said to a housewife was you burned the jello mould again. Tonight we're talking about the 1950s, that glossy Technicolor decade that your grandparents keep describing as simpler times. And sure, it was simple, simply terrifying. So before you get horizontal, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuine, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and your curiosity is exactly what keeps this channel going and growing, which means the world to me. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Also, we're now live on Spotify. Find the link in the description if you'd rather drift off there. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan, pull that blanket up, let yourself go a little limp. Now, before we begin, let's take a moment to really appreciate what you're about to learn. Have you ever wondered what it was like to go to a doctor who genuinely thought anxiety was a uterus problem? Have you considered what it meant to be a child in a decade when your school did nuclear blast drills by having you crouch under a wooden desk? Did people actually eat aspic, that trembling, savoury meat jelly suspended in gelatin, and call it a dinner party success? What happened if you were gay, or black, or simply a woman with an opinion? And how did an entire nation of presumably intelligent adults convince themselves that smoking was not only fine, but possibly good for you? Was the 1950s a golden age, or was it a golden cage, shiny on the outside, quietly suffocating within? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1952. The television is a piece of furniture, your doctor smokes in the examination room, and the most subversive thing in your house is a jazz record you keep under the bed. Enjoy your stay. Let's start with something that will make your lungs seize up just thinking about it. In the 1950s, cigarettes weren't a dirty habit. They were practically a wellness routine. Doctors smoked in their offices. Hospitals had cigarette vending machines in the lobbies. Pregnant women were told a cigarette might help with nerves. Advertisers ran campaigns with slogans like, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette," as though a physician lighting up between patient consultations was the medical endorsement you'd been waiting for. You didn't feel guilty reaching for a pack. You felt sophisticated, refined, almost healthy, really. You wake up in your 1950s kitchen, linoleum floor, percolator bubbling, husband already gone to work, and you light a cigarette before you've had coffee, because the cigarette is the morning, it's the ritual, it's the pause before the chaos of children and dishes and whatever's expected of you today. Nobody in your life has expressed any concern about this. Your doctor smokes in the examination room while reviewing your chart. Your dentist keeps a pack on his desk. Your obstetrician, the same man who delivered your children, once mentioned, with genuine professional confidence, that a cigarette could help calm the nerves during a difficult pregnancy. You filed that away as medical advice because it was. The tobacco industry had spent decades constructing this reality with meticulous care. In the 1940s and early 50s, the major cigarette brands competed not on flavour, but on medical credibility. Chesterfield claimed cigarettes were not irritating to the nose, throat and accessory organs. Lucky Strike told you that an independent survey found their cigarettes gentler on the throat. R.J. Reynolds hired actual physicians to endorse Camels, dressing them in white coats for print advertisements so thorough in their impersonation of medicine that you genuinely could not tell the difference between a doctor and a spokesperson. Some of them were both. You smoke in the car with the windows up and the children in the back seat. You smoke at the movies, the ashtray is built into the armrest, and the theatre fills gradually with a pleasant haze that softens the screen around the edges. You smoke at your kitchen table while helping your children with homework, tapping ash into a ceramic dish shaped like a leaf that your mother-in-law gave you as a housewarming gift. Everyone has one. Ashtrays are decor. Ashtrays are hospitality. When guests arrive, you put out fresh ashtrays the same way you put out coasters, because you are a competent host in 1953, and that is what competent hosts do. The few voices raising alarms are out there, but they are quiet, and the tobacco industry is very loud. In 1952, a Reader's Digest article titled "Cancer by the Carton" received wide attention and briefly rattled sales. The industry's response was elegant. They introduced filtered cigarettes, marketed specifically as the healthier option. The filter, it was implied, caught the bad parts. You could smoke Kent Micronite filter cigarettes and feel, with reasonable confidence, that you were making the responsible choice. What was in the filter, blue asbestos as it turned out, was not widely discussed. By mid-decade, approximately 45% of American adults smoked. The smell of cigarettes was the smell of offices, restaurants, airplanes, waiting rooms, living rooms, and bedrooms. It was the background note of everything. Non-smokers existed, but quietly, the way people with unusual dietary restrictions exist now, tolerated but slightly inconvenient at dinner parties. It would take until 1964 when the US Surgeon General finally issued the landmark report linking cigarettes definitively to cancer, for the cultural consensus to begin shifting. Until then, you smoke your morning cigarette, stare out the kitchen window at the neighbour's identical yard and feel for just a moment completely normal, which you were. That was the problem. Before you could drive to a supermarket or tap an app, your morning started with glass bottles of whole milk rattling up to your doorstep at 5 a.m, left by a man in a white uniform who also silently judged how many empties you'd left out. The milkman was a fixture of 1950s domestic life, part delivery service, part neighbourhood surveillance network, arriving before the rest of the world woke up, vanishing before anyone could ask questions. You never saw him leave, you just found the milk. It was oddly intimate for something so mundane, and frankly it set the tone for a decade that kept a lot of things unspoken. By the time you come downstairs in your housecoat, the milk is already on the step. 2 quarts of whole, 1 pint of cream, maybe a dozen eggs if you remember to leave the note. The bottles are cold and faintly sweating from the morning air, and you bring them in and line them up in the refrigerator with the small satisfaction of a task completed before breakfast, a task you didn't even technically do. The system just works. The milkman is reliable in the way very few things in the 1950s are discussed openly enough to be evaluated. The milk delivery network at its post-war peak was extraordinary. Approximately 30 million American families received regular doorstep delivery from local dairies. The milkman drove a route so consistent that he knew, by the arrangement of your empties and the notes tucked into the bottle tops, the rough shape of your week. Extra cream on a Thursday meant company coming. A sudden drop in order meant illness, or travel, or something else he wasn't going to ask about. He was discreet. He was professional. He was at your door before 5 a.m. and gone before most of the street was awake, which was a quality the 1950s deeply admired in a service provider. The milk itself was whole, unprocessed by modern standards. Cream rising to the top in a thick yellowing band that you shook back in or skimmed off, depending on what you were making that morning. Pasteurization was standard by the 50s, but homogenization was still being debated. Your milk looked like milk had always looked, slightly variable, slightly alive. You didn't think much about it. You poured it over cereal, put it in your children's glasses, added it to the percolator's companion cup of coffee, and got on with things. What you didn't talk about over the milk or otherwise was how the morning felt, whether the quiet of the house before everyone woke up felt like peace or like pressure. whether the system of bottles and notes and reliable delivery was comforting, or whether it was just another loop in the routine that kept you in place. The 1950s had no particular interest in that question. The milk arrived, the day began, you managed. That was the contract. And then, somewhere around 1963, the supermarket finished winning. Cheaper, more convenient, open all week, the grocery store offered everything the milkman brought, and 50 other things besides. Routes shortened, dairies consolidated. The morning bottles disappeared from doorsteps with quiet efficiency, the way things that were once indispensable always eventually do. What replaced them was a carton, waxy and anonymous, bought under fluorescent lights with a cart full of other things. It tasted the same. The morning felt different. Nobody said why exactly, which was also very 1950s of them. Here's a role that came with 0 pay, 0 sick days, 0 job title, and somehow infinite performance reviews from everyone around you. The American housewife. In the 1950s, a woman's domestic labour was not considered work. It was considered her natural state, like breathing or blinking. You cooked 3 meals a day, raised children, maintained the house, managed the social calendar, kept yourself attractive, stayed emotionally available, and did it all while wearing an apron and pretending it wasn't slowly killing you. The cultural message was delivered with a smile. This is what you wanted, isn't it? You are up before everyone else. This is not a choice. Exactly. It's a gravitational pull. The children need lunches packed. The husband needs breakfast before the commute. The kitchen doesn't organise itself. By 7 in the morning, you have already done an hour of invisible labour while the rest of the house slept. And when they come downstairs, you hand them things. Orange juice, toast, a permission slip that needs signing, a missing sock located through methods that remain unclear to everyone but you. They eat, they leave, the house goes quiet. And now your actual day begins. Laundry. The 1950s washing machine is better than the washboard it replaced, but it still requires your complete physical presence and attention. You load, you run, you wring, you hang. Drying is weather dependent, which means your entire laundry schedule is in conversation with the sky. You iron almost everything. Shirts, sheets, pillowcases, your husband's handkerchiefs, the children's school clothes. There is a specific way things are supposed to look. You know the specific way. You produce it daily. Cooking is its own profession, conducted without acknowledgement. Breakfast, a hot lunch if the children come home, dinner by 6. The pressure to cook well is social, not just domestic. Your food reflects on you as a wife, as a person, as a functioning member of the neighbourhood. Dinner parties require days of preparation. The wrong jello mould could generate comment. A fallen soufflé is a minor personal failure. Nobody uses those words. Nobody has to. In 1953, Betty Crocker's Picture Cookbook is one of the best-selling books in America. Not because women want to cook, some do, many don't, but because the expectation of cooking is total, and the infrastructure for learning it at scale is considerable. Cooking classes, cooking columns, cooking television programs. You learn, you produce, you're evaluated. The evaluation is generally silent, which somehow makes it worse. The deeper texture of the housewife's life, the one that doesn't appear in the magazine profiles or the appliance advertisements, is the isolation. The suburb is quiet during the day. Husbands are at work, children are at school, neighbours are in identical houses behind identical lawns, each woman alone in her kitchen with the television on for company. Friedan would call it the problem that has no name in 1963, and when women across America read those words, thousands of them reportedly wept. Not because the idea was new, but because someone had finally said it out loud, in print, where it could be seen. For now, though, It is 1954, and you have a casserole in the oven and a house that looks exactly as it should. And if there is something underneath all of that, something restless, something unnamed, you press it down with the back of a spoon and move on to the next thing. Because the next thing is always waiting. That's the job. Every Tuesday at 10 in the morning, a siren would wail across American cities, and school children would slide out of their chairs, crouch beneath wooden desks, cover their necks with their hands and wait. This was civil defense. This was the official government plan for surviving a nuclear attack. Duck, cover, and trust the furniture. Adults organized it with straight faces. Teachers drilled it weekly. The children did it without question, because when you grow up in a decade where the bomb is real and the Soviets have one too, you learn to tuck fear into your daily routine like a lunchbox and carry it quietly all the way home. You're 9 years old in 1953 and you know two things about nuclear weapons. 1, they're very powerful. 2, your desk will help. This is not information you have questioned. Your teacher leads the drill with the same brisk efficiency she brings to multiplication tables. Down, tuck, cover, and you comply, nose near the linoleum, hands laced over the back of your neck, listening to the muffled sound of your classmates doing the same. After 60 seconds, the all clear sounds and you climb back into your chair and continue long division. That's the drill. That's preparedness. The federal government had been in the civil defense business since the late 1940s, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, and the comfortable American assumption of nuclear monopoly evaporated overnight. The response was a nationwide public information campaign of spectacular optimism. The Federal Civil Defense Administration produced pamphlets, posters, and films assuring Americans that nuclear war was survivable if they just prepared correctly. The most famous of these was a 1951 animated short featuring a cartoon turtle named Bert, who demonstrated duck and cover technique with cheerful efficiency. Bert was shown in schools across the country for years. Physicists who understood what a nuclear blast actually did to a wooden desk were not prominently featured in the campaign. At home, the anxiety was managed differently, which is to say, it was mostly not managed at all. Parents did not sit their children down and explain the geopolitical situation. That wasn't how the 1950s operated. What happened instead was a kind of ambient dread, distributed evenly through popular culture that everyone agreed not to discuss directly. Civil defense literature stacked in living rooms. Magazines ran articles about stocking basement shelters with canned goods. The newspaper printed civil defense zone maps. You read them, noted where you fell, and made dinner. The hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll in 1954 produced a yield roughly 1,000 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb. The fallout cloud spread unexpectedly, contaminating inhabited islands and a Japanese fishing vessel whose crew suffered severe radiation sickness. This information reached the American public in filtered, measured doses. The government's position was essentially that things were under control and that a calm, prepared citizenry was the nation's best defense. What the decade never fully developed was language for what living under this threat actually felt like. Psychologists would later identify a phenomenon, nuclear anxiety or atomic dread, woven into the generation that grew up doing weekly blast drills. Children who practiced duck and cover into adolescence and adulthood carried something in them that looked, from the outside, like general restlessness or existential unease, and that traced back, when examined carefully, to the particular experience of being a small body under a desk, waiting for the all-clear that was, on some level, never entirely convincing. But for now it is Tuesday morning, and the siren has stopped, and you're back in your chair with your pencil, and the teacher is moving on, and outside the window the sky's perfectly blue, and the whole thing already feels like it didn't happen. Before the 1950s, a family evening meant talking, playing cards, listening to the radio, or in desperate cases, reading. Then the television showed up. A large, boxy, slightly humming piece of furniture that took up half the living room and demanded everyone face it simultaneously in respectful silence. By 1955, half of American homes had one. By 1960, almost everyone did. Dinner moved from the table to the tray. Conversation became commentary on whatever was flickering. Children stopped going outside with the urgency they once had. It was, depending on who you ask, either the greatest invention of the century or the beginning of the end of actual human presence. The first television your family owns arrives on a Saturday, carried in by two men from the appliance store who set it against the living room wall with the confidence of people installing something permanently. The set is a Motorola, 17-inch screen in a blonde wood cabinet, and it hums faintly when you first plug it in, the screen warming from black to a pale, flickering grey before the image resolves. Your children gather in front of it on the floor. They will remain there, in some configuration, for the next several years. In 1950, there were approximately 3 million television sets in American homes. By 1960, there were 60 million. The growth curve was nearly vertical, the fastest adoption of a consumer technology in American history, outpacing the refrigerator, the washing machine, and the automobile. It was as though the country had been waiting for a reason to stop talking to each other, and the television was the polite excuse everyone needed. Programming in the early 50s was limited and largely live. Variety shows, wrestling, Milton Berle, Texaco Star Theatre. By mid-decade it had expanded. Sitcoms, westerns, game shows, soap operas, news broadcasts. The schedule became a daily architecture. You knew what was on at 8. You arranged your evening around it. I Love Lucy debuted in 1951, and within a year was watched by nearly 30 million people weekly, more viewers than any radio program had ever achieved. When Lucy was pregnant on screen, and her real pregnancy was written into the show, the episode in which she delivered drew 68% of all American television viewers, which means that on the night of January 19th, 1953, roughly 44 million people were watching the same thing at the same time, and it was a woman having a baby on television. The television changed what you ate. TV dinners, Swanson's version launched in 1953, were designed specifically for the new furniture arrangement of the American living room. A tray, a frozen compartmentalized meal, a fork, and a screen. You didn't need the dinner table anymore. Conversation had been replaced by a shared viewing experience, which felt like togetherness and was adjacent to it without being quite the same thing. What got quieter? Long evenings of talk, children's imaginative outdoor play after dark, the radio drama requiring you to picture things in your head, the habit of sitting with silence. What got louder? The set, which was never fully off, humming in the background of the household like a new kind of hearth. Parents worried about what children were watching. Ministers worried about content. Media critics wrote serious essays about the cultural implications of passive consumption. The television industry responded by producing more television. By the end of the decade, the set in the living room wasn't a novelty or an appliance. It was the centre of the house. Everything else, furniture, schedules, dinner time, conversation itself, had arranged itself around it, quietly, the way things do when no one makes a formal announcement. If you were a woman in the 1950s experiencing what doctors classified as emotional instability, which could mean depression, anxiety, marital unhappiness, or simply being too opinionated, there was a chance your physician might gently suggest a lobotomy, not as a last resort, as a reasonable early option. The transorbital lobotomy, pioneered by Walter Freeman, had been popularized across America with evangelical zeal. Freeman toured the country performing the procedure in mobile units, inserting an ice pick-like tool through the eye socket and calling it a solution to nervousness. Families agreed, hospitals agreed, and the patients afterward were much quieter. Walter Freeman performed his first transorbital lobotomy in his Washington office in 1946, using an ice pick from his kitchen drawer. He was a neurologist, not a surgeon. He had not bothered with the formality of an operating room because, as he saw it, the procedure didn't require one. It took 10 minutes. It was, he believed, a solution, clean, portable, available. Over the following 2 decades, he would perform or oversee approximately 3,500 lobotomies across the United States, driving a van he called the lobotomobile from state institution to state institution, demonstrating his technique, training other physicians and chronicling results in meticulous notes that described patients with a particular satisfaction of a man who considers his work largely complete. You are a wife and mother in 1952. You have been crying on and off for several months. You cannot explain it well enough to satisfy anyone. Your husband is worried, then irritated, then worried again. Your family doctor listens to your description of the heaviness in your chest, the difficulty getting through the day, the feeling that something is wrong that you cannot name, and he refers you to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist has several options available: insulin shock therapy, deliberate hypoglycemic coma, induced repeatedly, intended to reset the brain; electroconvulsive therapy, administered without anesthesia, leaving you with gaps in memory and a soreness in the jaw that persists for days. Or if those don't produce the desired results, a referral to Dr. Freeman. Families consented to lobotomies for relatives with a range of diagnoses that today reads as a catalogue of entirely treatable conditions: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and, in documented cases, homosexuality. What they were told was that the procedure could reduce suffering. What often resulted was a patient who was no longer distressed because they were no longer entirely present, flattened, compliant, less recognisably themselves. Freeman counted this as success. His published papers described post-operative patients who are now able to perform household tasks without complaint as evidence of positive outcomes. He was not wrong that they complained less. He had removed the capacity. By the early 1950s, lobotomy had been normalized to the degree that it received a Nobel Prize. Walter Hess and Egas Moniz shared the 1949 prize in physiology and medicine, with Moniz honored in part for developing the prefrontal lobotomy procedure. The scientific community celebrated. The patients were not consulted. The procedure began to fall from favour in the mid-50s as antipsychotic medications offered a pharmaceutical alternative to surgical brain alteration. Chlorpromazine, introduced in the United States in 1954, could achieve a kind of chemical calm that approximated what Freeman had been doing with an ice pick, and it was reversible, which the ice pick was not. Freeman continued performing lobotomies into the 1960s, long after his colleagues had moved on, defending the procedure in letters and lectures until his death in 1972. The patients from his peak years are largely untraceable in the historical record. They exist in case files described in the third person, their names replaced by initials, their outcomes measured in whether they could dress themselves or return to domestic function. Some recovered partial selves, many did not. They had asked for help with the unbearable weight of something real, and the decade had responded with a very clean solution. In the 1950s, across the American South, and in quieter, less codified ways across the North, racial segregation was not a crisis. It was a Tuesday. Separate drinking fountains, separate schools, separate waiting rooms, separate everything, maintained by law, enforced by violence, and accepted by white America as the natural order of things. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955, she wasn't doing something that everyone agreed was obviously overdue. She was doing something that got her arrested. The comfort of an entire civilization had been built deliberately on the premise that some people simply didn't count as fully human, and 1950s America wore that premise like a well-pressed suit. You are a black man living in Birmingham, Alabama in 1953. Your daily life is a continuous map of what is permitted and what is not, and the map is maintained by signs, custom, and the reliable threat of violence. You drink from a different fountain. You sit in the back of the bus. You enter through separate doors. You address white men as sir and are addressed by your first name in return, regardless of your age, your education, or what you've accomplished. The rules are not written in one place. They are distributed across the entire architecture of the city, the state, and the culture, so thoroughly embedded that to a white person in the same city they are largely invisible. That invisibility is the point. The legal framework for segregation had been in place since the 1870s, and the Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson ruling in 1896, establishing separate but equal as constitutional doctrine, had provided the judicial language that rationalized the next several decades of American apartheid. By the 1950s, the system was deeply entrenched. Segregated schools, segregated hospitals, segregated hotels, segregated beaches. The GE Bill, which funded education and housing loans for returning veterans and helped build the post-war middle class, was administered in ways that largely excluded black veterans. The suburbs being built on the edges of American cities were, by deed restriction and federal lending policy, white. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that racially segregated public schools were unconstitutional, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson after more than 50 years. The White South's response was fury. Politicians signed the Southern Manifesto pledging to resist desegregation. School boards moved slowly, then stopped moving. In Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, the governor called out the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Central High School, and the president was required to deploy the 101st Airborne to escort 9 teenagers to class. The 9 students were followed through hallways, screamed at, threatened. They entered the school anyway. This was considered at the time enormously controversial. The 1950s civil rights movement was not inevitable, and the people who built it knew it. Rosa Parks was not a tired seamstress who spontaneously refused to move because her feet hurt. The story that circulated for decades stripped her of her significance. She was a trained activist, secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, who had been studying civil rights organizing at the Highlander Folk School. Her arrest was a planned act of resistance by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and what it would cost. The 381-day Montgomery bus boycott that followed organized a black community with tremendous discipline, coordination, and sacrifice across more than a year. White 1950s. America watched most of this through the frame of inconvenience and disruption. The arrangement had worked well enough for them for a very long time. Change would require not just legislation, but a confrontation with the comfortable assumption that the way things had always been was simply how things were. Mid-century American cuisine operated under a core belief that technology could improve food the same way it had improved cars and washing machines. The result was an era of deeply experimental cooking that produced dishes so aggressively creative they bordered on punishment. Gelatin was put in everything. Canned cream of mushroom soup became a universal sauce. Vegetables were boiled until they surrendered all colour and will to live, then buried in casseroles under crackers. A successful dinner party meant a jello mould containing suspended vegetables, fruit, or, if the hostess was feeling ambitious, actual chunks of meat. Guests ate it and said it was wonderful. Nobody fully understood why. The 1950s. American kitchen was a space of considerable optimism and occasionally spectacular judgment errors. Modern refrigerators and gas ranges were available to more households than ever before. The processed food industry was expanding at speed, and the home economist, a profession treated in this decade with genuine professional respect, had concluded that the future of cooking lay in convenience, efficiency, and the strategic deployment of products that arrived pre-assembled from factories. You were not failing your family by opening a can. You were being modern. You were keeping pace. Consider the casserole. The casserole is the signature dish of 1950s home cooking, and it operates on a principle of radical democracy. Every ingredient is equally buried, equally submerged in cream of mushroom soup, equally indistinguishable from every other ingredient by the time it reaches the table. Tuna noodle casserole, green bean casserole, introduced by Campbell's Soup in 1955 and served to approximately 20 million American families that Thanksgiving. Chicken casserole with crushed potato chips on top. The casserole was practical. One dish, fed many, could be assembled the night before, and it was the cooking equivalent of a shrug. Edible, efficient, and not asking very much of anyone involved. But the Jell-O mold is where the decade fully revealed its ambitions. Gelatin was sold by General Foods with the evangelical enthusiasm of a product that could do anything, and the post-war home economics establishment agreed. Cookbooks of the period, many published with corporate sponsorship from gelatin and canned food manufacturers, proposed savoury Jell-O molds with suspended olives, carrots, and boiled shrimp. Tomato aspic, a shuddering red disc of tomato juice solidified into a shape, was considered an elegant starter. Lime Jell-O with cream cheese and crushed pineapple was brought to every potluck from 1950 to 1963 and received each time as a genuine contribution. The food was also frequently beige, not by accident, by philosophy. The goal was consistency, reliability, the erasure of culinary surprise. Overboiling vegetables was not a failure, it was standard technique, the safe removal of textural unpredictability. A carrot should not surprise you. A green bean should not offer resistance. The table was a place of comfort and function, not sensation. And sensation was slightly suspect anyway. A little too European, a little too much. The irony is that the decade that produced all of this was also the decade when Julia Child was in France, learning to cook in a way that took ingredients seriously and treated flavour as an end in itself. She returned to America, and in 1961, Mastering the Art of French Cooking was published, and something began to shift. Americans encountered the idea that a vegetable could be cooked briefly, in butter, and taste like itself. It was, for some readers, genuinely revelatory. But that is 1961, and this is still the 50s, and tonight there is a ham and jello loaf in the refrigerator, and you have topped it with maraschino cherries in a pattern, because you are an excellent cook, and this is what excellent cooking looks like, and you are going to serve it on your good china and nobody is going to say a word. Before the Salk vaccine arrived in 1955, summer in America carried a specific dread: polio season. Every year, as temperatures rose, the virus moved through swimming pools, movie theatres and playgrounds, paralysing children without warning or logic. Parents pulled their kids from public spaces, pools closed, church camps were cancelled, and every summer news spread through neighbourhoods like cold water: another child in an iron lung, another family whose child would never walk the same way again. The fear was specific and physical, the kind that makes you check your children's legs in the morning and feel briefly, guiltily grateful when they move fine. You're a mother in 1952 and summer has arrived, and you are afraid in the particular way that has no comfortable expression. You don't say it out loud, not entirely because saying it feels like tempting the thing you're afraid of. But you watch your children at the neighbourhood pool, and you count the days since the last reported case in your county, and you note, without meaning to, which children look flushed, which ones are moving funny, which ones complained of a headache at dinner. You're not being paranoid. You're doing the math of a disease that has no logic yet. Poliomyelitis, had been circulating in America in epidemic waves since the late 19th century. But the 1950s epidemics were its peak American years. In 1952, nearly 58,000 cases were reported in the United States, the worst single year in American polio history. Of those, over 3,000 died. Over 21,000 were left with some degree of paralysis. The victims were disproportionately children, and the disease moved fastest through exactly the environments of post-war middle-class suburban life: the public pool, the movie theatre, the crowded summertime playground. The better your neighbourhood, in some perverse epidemiological irony, the higher your risk. Improved sanitation had actually reduced childhood exposure to poliovirus in infancy. When immunity transferred from mothers offered some protection, leaving older children more vulnerable. The iron lung was the decade's most vivid image of medical extremity. A large metal cylinder encasing the body from the neck down, its rhythmic compression and release breathing for patients whose respiratory muscles had been paralyzed. Children spent months in them, sometimes years. Some spent decades. The machines lined hospital wards during epidemic seasons, rows of cylinders, a face visible at each end, children reading, eating, being read to, living their lives in a metal tube because their lungs would no longer work on their own. Nurses moved between them. Parents stood in doorways with the particular expression of people managing something that has no appropriate expression. Jonas Salk began developing his killed virus vaccine in the early 50s, funded in part by the March of Dimes, a foundation created specifically to fight polio, whose annual fundraising drives were run through school children collecting dimes in small cardboard folders. On April 12, 1955, the 10th anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt's death, Salk's vaccine was declared safe and effective. The announcement produced a response in America rarely associated with medical news. Church bells rang. Schools dismissed early. Parents wept in streets and pharmacies. The paediatrician Thomas Francis, who had run the clinical trials, read the results to a packed auditorium at the University of Michigan, while the announcement was broadcast nationwide by radio and television. Salk was immediately a national hero of the order that required no further explanation. The vaccine began distribution immediately. Inoculation campaigns ran through schools, clinics, and public health departments. By the end of the decade, polio cases had dropped by more than 90%. The pool opened. The camp reopened. Summer became summer again, with its ordinary texture of heat and noise, and children who were, most of them, going to be fine. You still watch your children move. You probably always will. Some fears don't fully unlearn themselves, even when the thing that caused them is gone. But the specific dread of those summers, the morning leg check, the neighbourhood whisper, the iron lung visible in the newspaper, that particular weight lifted quietly, off an entire generation of parents who had carried it for years without fully realising how heavy it was. In the early 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy convinced a meaningful portion of America that communist infiltrators were hiding in plain sight, in Hollywood, in the State Department, in universities, in your neighbour's den. You could be accused without evidence. You could be summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked to name names. Careers ended, friendships dissolved. People reported each other out of fear, out of spite, out of self-preservation. The most dangerous thing you could be in 1952 was someone who once attended the wrong meeting, or signed the wrong petition, or simply seemed a little too interested in workers' rights. America ran on fear, and McCarthy held the thermostat. On February 9th, 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy stood before the Republican Women's Club in Wheeling, West Virginia, and held up a piece of paper. He claimed it contained the names of 205 known communists currently employed by the United States State Department. The number changed in subsequent speeches, 205, then 81, then 57, but the certainty never wavered. McCarthy didn't need the numbers to be consistent. He needed people to be afraid, and afraid they already were. The Soviet Union had the bomb, China had fallen to communism, American soldiers were fighting in Korea, and the country was in the mood to believe that something was very wrong from the inside. You're a screenwriter in Hollywood in 1951. You have attended, a decade ago, several meetings of a leftist theatre group that also included some Communist Party members. You didn't join the party. You went to 4 meetings and found the conversation interesting and then moved on. You have not thought about it in years. Then you receive a letter. You have been named by a former acquaintance who was summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee and chose under pressure to provide names. You are now a name. The Hollywood blacklist at its widest extent included over 300 writers, directors, and actors. Some were communists, many were not. The distinction was not operationally the most important thing. What mattered was the accusation. The studios, under pressure from HUAC and under the threat of boycotts organised by groups like the American Legion, refused to employ anyone named. The blacklisted could not work under their own names. Some used fronts, other writers who agreed to put their names on the actual blacklisted writers' work. Some left the country. Dalton Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10 imprisoned for contempt of Congress after refusing to cooperate with HUAC, wrote scripts under pseudonyms for years. He won an Oscar in 1956 under the name Robert Rich, and no one came to claim it. McCarthy's power was built on a simple mechanism. The accusation was the punishment. You didn't need to be convicted of anything. You didn't need to have done anything. You needed only to have been named, and the job you had yesterday would be gone tomorrow, because employers couldn't afford the association, and your friends couldn't afford the association with you. And the whole thing moved through social and professional networks like a very efficient virus. People cooperated with HUAC not because they believed they were doing the right thing, but because refusing to cooperate made you the next name. Edward R. Murrow's television broadcast of March 9th, 1954, 30 minutes on CBS using McCarthy's own footage, his own words, his own evasions, did not destroy McCarthy alone, but it punctured the aura of invincibility. The Army McCarthy hearings that same year, broadcast live on television, let the country watch McCarthy operate in real time, bullying, contradicting himself, pursuing irrelevancies with the relentlessness of a man who'd confused volume with authority. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" Army Counsel Joseph Welch asked on June 9th, 1954, and the country watched McCarthy's face as the room went quiet. The Senate censured McCarthy in December of that year. He died in 1957 of hepatitis, probably accelerated by his considerable drinking, largely discredited. But the infrastructure he helped build, the lists, the committees, the social cost of being named, had done its work. The people whose careers ended didn't get them back. The ones who named names lived with that. The ones who were named lived with that differently. Everyone kept the experience very carefully filed, in the part of the mind where you put the things you did in order to survive, and try not to open too often. After the war, millions of Americans left the city for the suburbs, lured by the promise of a lawn, a carport, and a house that looked exactly like every other house on the block. Levittown materialized out of Long Island farmland almost overnight. 4,000 homes, built on an assembly line, each one identical, affordable, and quietly revolutionary. You could own something. Your children could have a yard. The American dream was a 3-bedroom ranch house with a picture window. What wasn't discussed quite so openly was what the dream excluded: the deeds that legally barred black families from buying, the isolation that quietly drove housewives to Valium, the invisible walls that kept the suburb looking exactly the way its designers intended. William Levitt built his first Levittown on Long Island beginning in 1947, and the method was pure industrial logic applied to housing. He owned the lumber yards, he owned the nail-making operation. He broke construction into 27 sequential steps, and assigned each step to a specialized crew, moving down the street in sequence, producing a finished house every 16 minutes at peak operation. The houses were small by later standards, 800 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, but they sold for $7,990, financed with Veterans Administration loans that required no down payment for eligible veterans. The waiting list stretched for miles. You're a veteran in 1949, and you have spent 4 years in a war and 3 years before that in a Depression-era apartment where 3 people shared a bedroom. The Levittown house is not large. You don't care. It has a yard. Your children can play in it and you can see them from the kitchen window. And that specific image, children in a yard, visible from a kitchen window, in a house you own, is the image that carried you through the worst of everything. And now it is real, and you sign the papers with a hand that is not entirely steady. What the promotional materials did not mention, and what the mortgage paperwork made concrete. The standard Levittown deed contained a covenant prohibiting the sale or rental of the property to anyone other than members of the Caucasian race. This was not an oversight or an eccentricity of one developer. Racially restrictive covenants were standard practice across post-war suburban development, reinforced by Federal Housing Administration lending guidelines that explicitly rated neighborhoods with black residents as poor investment risks, a practice known as redlining. The wealth-building engine of post-war American homeownership, equity appreciation, the intergenerational transfer of property, was built with a gate on it, and the gate had a very clear policy. The suburb also had a texture that revealed itself only after you arrived. The distance from everything, from work, from the city, from the variety of urban life, was managed by the car, which meant the suburb was legible only to people who drove. Women who did not drive, or families with one car that left every morning with a husband, found themselves geographically stranded in a landscape of identical houses with no public transit and nowhere to walk to. The supermarket was 2 miles away. The library was farther. Your neighbours were friendly and identical in ways that made genuine intimacy surprisingly difficult to locate. By the late 50s, the suburb had become America's dominant residential form. It had also become the setting for a specific kind of quiet desperation that would fuel the literature, the therapy culture, and the social upheavals of the following decade. But for now, the lawn is green and the mortgage payment is manageable, and the children are in the yard where you can see them, and you have built the life you were promised, and it would feel ungrateful to say it isn't quite enough. So you don't say it. You mow the lawn instead. Long before screens followed you everywhere, there was the drive-in theatre. A vast flat parking lot full of cars, a towering screen, a tinny speaker hooked to your window, and the warm enclosed feeling of being in public while also being completely alone. In the 1950s, there were over 4,000 drive-ins across America. You went on dates there. You took your kids there. You occasionally watch the movie. The drive-in was less about cinema and more about the experience of going somewhere together without technically having to interact. In retrospect, it was the prototype for the smartphone, a screen you stared at while technically being present with other humans. The drive-in theatre was invented in 1933 by Richard Hollingshead of New Jersey, who mounted a projector on the hood of his car, stretched a screen between two trees in his driveway, and charged 25 cents admission. The concept expanded slowly through the 30s and 40s, then exploded in the post-war decade when Americans had cars, disposable income, children who needed somewhere to be, and a cultural permission to make the automobile the centre of leisure life. By 1958, there were more than 4,000 drive-ins operating across the country, more than there were conventional indoor theatres. You're 17 in 1956, and you've borrowed your father's Chevrolet, and your date is in the passenger seat, and you've pulled into the Starlight Drive-In on Route 9 and hung the speaker on the window, and the speaker crackles and hisses and delivers the movie's audio in a tinny approximation that makes everything sound like it's happening inside a tin can during a light rain. The movie is, honestly, it doesn't matter. You're not here for the movie. Everyone at the drive-in is here for approximately the same reasons: proximity, privacy, and the social cover of a screen that gives you something to be ostensibly doing. The drive-in offered something the indoor theatre did not: the car. Your car was your room, your living room, your private territory in a decade when private territory for teenagers essentially did not exist at home. At the drive-in, you were in your own contained space, surrounded by hundreds of other contained spaces, each one with its own small drama unfolding behind glass. Children in pyjamas in the back seat of station wagons watching cartoons on a screen the size of a building until they fell asleep and were carried inside. Couples in front seats arranged in configurations that would have concerned their parents considerably if their parents could see through glass at a distance of 50 feet in the dark. The experience was inseparable from food. The drive-in concession stand sold popcorn, hot dogs, hamburgers and soft drinks in containers designed for car consumption. The intermission, a scheduled break between features during double bills, was structured around a concession run, soundtracked by an animated short encouraging you to visit the snack bar, featuring dancing hot dogs and smiling cups of soda that became unintentionally iconic. You ate in your car. Everything was slightly greasy. It was completely fine. The drive-in began its long decline in the 1960s and 70s as land values rose, suburbs expanded in ways that created light pollution, and indoor multiplexes offered more controlled environments for less. By the 1980s, thousands had closed. Today, fewer than 300 remain operating in the United States, each one a small, stubborn monument to the specific pleasure of going somewhere to watch something while technically staying in your car. Which, considered plainly, is also what a lot of people do with their phones at dinner. The technology changed. The instinct is identical. By the mid-1950s, a tranquilizer called Miltown had become the most prescribed drug in America. Doctors handed it out to housewives complaining of anxiety, restlessness, dissatisfaction, symptoms that, viewed from today, look a lot like the entirely reasonable response to being trapped in a domestic role, with no exit and no language to describe the problem. The pills were called Mother's Little Helpers before the Rolling Stones made the phrase famous. Women took them, smiled more, got quieter, and the underlying architecture of their unhappiness remained perfectly intact, undisturbed, just slightly more bearable, which was the whole point. Miltown, Maproba Mate, arrived in the United States in 1955 and became, within 2 years, the fastest-selling pharmaceutical in American history. Pharmacies ran out of it. A black market emerged. Celebrities mentioned it in interviews with the casual frankness of people discussing a new brand of toothpaste. Milton Berle joked about it on television and earned the nickname Milltown Berle. The drug was positioned not as a psychiatric medication but as a mild relaxant, something you took the way you might take an aspirin, except instead of headache pain, it addressed the low-grade nervous tension that seemed, in the medical framing of the era, to be the natural condition of the American housewife. You're 34 years old in 1957, and your doctor has given you a prescription. You didn't describe anything dramatic to him. No breakdown, no crisis. You described feeling tired and tense and unable to stop thinking about things that probably weren't worth thinking about. He listened for a reasonable amount of time, asked whether you were sleeping, wrote the prescription, and moved on to his next patient. The appointment took 12 minutes. You fill the prescription at the drugstore on the way home and take the first tablet with a glass of water at the kitchen sink. And by evening, something has softened, and you cannot tell if it's the pill or just the relief of having been given something to take. The demand for pharmaceutical calm in the 1950s was not irrational. It was the logical response to a structural problem without a structural solution. Women were educated, intelligent, and channeled into a domestic role that offered no intellectual engagement, no professional recognition, no financial independence, and no socially acceptable exit. The medical establishment, composed almost entirely of men, interpreted the resulting distress as a medical symptom rather than a social condition. The solution was pharmaceutical. Adjust the woman's brain chemistry until the environment she was in became tolerable. This was called treatment. Valium diazepam arrived in 1963, more effective and more broadly prescribed than Milltown, and extended the pharmaceutical management of female unhappiness well into the following decade. At its peak in the early 1970s, Valium was the most widely prescribed medication in the Western world. The majority of prescriptions went to women. The drug was not a conspiracy. The doctors who prescribed it were not malicious. Most believed they were helping. What they were doing, more precisely, was managing a symptom while leaving the condition that caused it entirely untouched, like giving someone stronger sunglasses instead of repairing the broken window letting in the glare. What the quiet epidemic revealed, when examined with any clarity, was a decade-long medical consensus that women's emotional reality was a pharmaceutical problem, not a social one, not a political one, certainly not a structural one worth restructuring. The pill was the answer. The pill made it all a little softer, a little further away, a little more livable. And for many women, in the absence of any other option, it did. That it worked, in the narrow functional sense, was precisely the problem. In the 1950s, the ideal American father went to work, came home, ate dinner, read the newspaper, watched television, and remained a largely ambient presence in the family unit, appreciated, respected, technically present, and emotionally unavailable in ways that nobody had yet developed the vocabulary to describe. Fatherhood was defined almost entirely by breadwinning. You paid the mortgage, you fulfilled the contract. Changing a diaper, having a feeling, discussing a problem with your child, these were optional. Optional like dessert on a Tuesday. Nice if they happened, not expected, not required, and slightly alarming if pursued with too much enthusiasm. You leave the house at 7:30. You drive to the train, or you drive to the office, or you drive to the plant, depending on who you are and what year you were born and what your father did. The commute is yours, one of the few spaces in daily life that belongs entirely to you. Neither the office nor the home, a brief suspended state that the decade does not have much language for, but that functions, for many men, as a kind of decompression chamber between the professional self and the domestic one. You arrive home at 6, dinner is on the table. This is not a coincidence. Your wife has timed it. The breadwinner model of fatherhood was not new in the 1950s, but the post-war prosperity gave it a particular definition. A good father provided, and providing in the 1950s meant a specific package. House in the suburb, car in the drive, wife at home, children in the yard. The material provision was visible, quantifiable, and understood by everyone as the primary metric. Whether the man behind the provision was warm, present, engaged, or even particularly aware of his children's emotional lives was not part of the publicly evaluated criteria. Fathers were respected from a distance. Closeness was the mother's territory. Benjamin Spock's Common Sense book of baby and child care, published in 1946 and the best-selling book in America through the 1950s, addressed itself almost entirely to mothers. Fathers appear in its pages occasionally, usually in the context of financial provision or disciplinary authority, the person called in when the mother's management of a situation required backup. Spock was more progressive than many of his contemporaries in several ways, but the structure of his assumed household was standard. Mother present and primary, father useful and peripheral. The emotional cost of this arrangement distributed itself unevenly. Men who had been through the war carried things that had no acceptable venue for expression in the 1950s household. Therapy was for people with serious problems. Talking about feelings was not really a thing men did in this decade, not in any recognised social form. What happened to the weight of what they'd seen, what they'd done, what they'd lost? It went somewhere. Some men drank, some worked compulsively. Some were simply very quiet in the evenings in ways their children would spend decades trying to interpret. The children, meanwhile, grew up with a father-shaped space in the household, a presence whose emotional content was largely undefined, whose approval meant everything and was expressed sparingly, whose interior life was almost entirely private. The therapists of the 1970s, 80s and 90s made a substantial living off this dynamic, as the children of the 50s arrived in adulthood carrying the weight of relationships with fathers who had never quite been fully present, in a decade that never thought to ask them to be. It would be easy to judge, but judgment misses the mechanism. These were men formed by a depression and a war and a culture that had never once suggested that being a father meant anything other than providing the foundation other people built their lives on, that they held the foundation steady for years in silence, was real, that the silence cost everyone something was also real. The decade just hadn't invented the conversation for it yet. In the 1950s, your body, particularly if you were a woman, was subject to constant, cheerful, publicly endorsed assessment. Your weight, your waist measurement, your skin, your hair, your posture, your overall fitness for domestic life. Women's magazines ran articles with titles like "Are you too fat to be loved?" as though that was a question worth asking in print, in national distribution, to real human beings. Department stores had weigh-in stations. Doctors told women their correct ideal weight at nearly every appointment, often with the confidence of someone revealing a moral truth. To have a body that deviated from the approved template was not a neutral fact. It was a personal failure, publicly catalogued. You pick up a copy of Ladies' Home Journal in 1954 and find, within the first 15 pages, an advertisement for a reducing cream that promises to slim your thighs through twice daily application, a feature article on the correct diet for the American housewife that recommends 1,200 calories and no exceptions, and a column written by a physician who explains that being overweight indicates a deficiency of character as much as of nutrition. You put the magazine down, then you pick it up again, because there's a good recipe in the back, and also because the accumulated message of every magazine, every television commercial, every department store mirror has become the water you swim in, and you've stopped noticing that it's very cold. The 1950s female ideal was specific: a cinched waist, A full bust, tapered legs, a posture suggesting competence and availability simultaneously. Dior's new look of 1947, nipped waist, full skirt, an aesthetic of structured femininity, had set the visual template, and the garment industry, the diet industry, and the beauty industry spent the following decade helping women approximate it. Foundation garments, girdles, were worn by most women from early adolescence onward, compressing the body into the approved silhouette beneath the dress. You wore the girdle to the grocery store, you wore it to church, you wore it on hot summer days because the body underneath it was not the body that was publicly permitted. The diet industry in the 1950s was already a substantial business, offering everything from amphetamine-based reducing pills dispensed freely by physicians to meal replacement shakes to calorie-counting guides published by the same magazines that published the recipes you were supposed to be cooking for your family. The contradiction: prepare rich, cream-based casseroles for your husband and children, and also maintain a figure that requires chronic caloric restriction, was not addressed directly. It was simply the dual expectation, sitting side by side on the magazine page, the way dual expectations do in a decade that has decided the gap between them is the woman's problem to bridge. Men's bodies existed in a different moral framework. A prosperous man's weight was evidence of prosperity. Advertising of the era sold products, beer, red meat, substantial food, to men with the unambiguous message that appetite was healthy and masculine. The physical ideal for men was broad, solid, capable. Body hair was normal. Imperfect skin was not remarked upon. The cultural surveillance apparatus aimed at the female body simply did not have a male equivalent, and nobody found this worth noting aloud. What the decade could not see, because it didn't yet have the research to show it clearly, was the downstream damage, the disordered eating habits, the lifelong relationship with food warped by years of restriction and shame, the internalized assessment running constantly beneath the surface of daily life. The generation of women raised in the 50s body culture would carry it into the 60s and 70s and pass pieces of it to their daughters in ways they mostly didn't intend. The scales got put away eventually. The voices they installed did not go as quietly. In 1956, Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, and America began building the interstate highway system. 41,000 miles of concrete connecting the country in a way that reshaped everything, where people lived, where they worked, where they ate, where they shopped, and who they never had to encounter again. The highway didn't just move people, it evacuated cities. White families left urban neighborhoods for suburbs accessible only by car. The communities left behind lost tax base, businesses, investment. The highway was presented as progress. It was also, depending on where you were standing, demolition. Eisenhower's interest in a national highway system predated his presidency by decades. As a young army officer in 1919, he had participated in the military convoy, the first transcontinental motorized military convoy across the United States. A journey that took 62 days on roads so poor that vehicles broke down constantly, sank into mud, and fell through bridges. The experience left him convinced that modern infrastructure was a national security issue. Then, as Supreme Allied commander in Europe, he had watched the German Autobahn allow the Wehrmacht to move troops and equipment with extraordinary speed. He arrived in the presidency in 1953 with a clear conviction: America needed its own system, and it needed it now. You're driving in 1958 on a stretch of Interstate 70 in Ohio, and the road beneath you is smooth and wide, and goes in a straight line for as far as you can see, and the sensation is genuinely new. Roads before the interstate were routed through towns, past gas stations and diners and grain elevators, full of stoplights and slow farm vehicles and the ordinary texture of the American landscape. The interstate bypasses all of it. You're moving at 65 miles per hour through a corridor of engineered land, and the world outside the windshield is less a place you're passing through than a backdrop scrolling behind you. It is efficient. It is slightly inhuman. It is America's preferred direction. The highway system was the single largest public works project in American history. It required the displacement of enormous numbers of people, mostly poor, mostly black, from urban neighborhoods that lay in the path of the planned routes. Highway planning in city after city, Baltimore, Nashville, Miami, San Francisco, ran the new roads directly through the least politically powerful communities. Neighborhoods that had existed for generations were cut in half or erased entirely. The people displaced received minimal compensation and were relocated into public housing projects that would define American urban poverty for the next 50 years. The process was documented, protested, and proceeded anyway, because the highway was national priority, national infrastructure, national progress, and the people in its way were not the people running the planning commissions. For the Americans, the highway served most directly: white, suburban, car-owning. The interstate was transformative in the most positive sense. It connected previously remote regions. It made long-distance travel routine. It created the commercial strip, the exit ramp lined with gas stations, motels, and fast food restaurants that gave every American landscape a family resemblance, regardless of geography. Howard Johnson's, Holiday Inn, McDonald's, the franchised, standardized roadside American landscape was a direct product of the interstate. Businesses that could count on predictable traffic flows and build identical versions of themselves at every viable exit. The highway also quietly finished the project the suburb had started: the structural separation of American life by race and income. The city, emptied of its middle class and bisected by elevated concrete, became the place where you were poor, or black, or both. The suburb, accessible only by the highway, was where you were something else. The road connected everyone in theory. In practice, it was one of the most effective tools of spatial segregation the country had ever built. It just looked like concrete, which made it easy to call it neutral. In the 1950s, corporal punishment wasn't a controversial parenting choice. It was the manual. You misbehaved, you were spanked, paddled, or sent to get the belt. At school, teachers kept wooden paddles in desk drawers. Principals had offices specifically equipped for the purpose. The prevailing wisdom, backed by the era's pediatricians and endorsed by most religious institutions, was that pain was a reliable and appropriate teacher. Children who were hit regularly did not call it trauma. They called it Tuesday. The idea that physical punishment might cause psychological harm was not yet a mainstream concern. It was, in fact, somewhat radical. You're 6 years old and you have done something, knocked over a glass, talked back, failed to come when called, and the consequence is immediate, physical, and administered without particular anger by a parent who considers this the correct response because their parents administered it, and their grandparents administered it, and the continuity of the practice is itself a form of evidence that it works. You cry, you're told to stop crying, or there will be more. You stop crying, or at least you stop the parts that are audible. Later at dinner, the incident is not discussed. You pass the potatoes. The lesson has been delivered. The legal and cultural permission for corporal punishment of children in the 1950s was total. Parents had near absolute authority over their children's physical treatment. Schools operated under the doctrine of in loco parentis, in the place of the parent, which in practice meant that teachers and administrators had the same rights over a child's body that the parent did, and the parent had more or less unlimited rights. Paddling in schools was standard in most American states. Some schools had formal policies specifying the number of strokes per offence and requiring a witness. Others left it entirely to teacher discretion. Either way, the paddle hung in the principal's office as a visible deterrent, and children moved through the building with the knowledge that their bodies were subject to institutional authority in a very direct and physical sense. The theological framework supporting corporal punishment was robust and frequently cited. Spare the rod, spoil the child, a loose paraphrase of Proverbs 13 verse 24, was invoked with the confidence of people quoting scripture that has one obvious meaning. Religious instruction manuals recommended physical correction as a component of proper Christian parenting. Sunday school materials distinguish between punishment administered in anger, which was excessive, and punishment administered calmly for clear violations of known rules, which was sound parenting. The calm made it acceptable. The ritual made it education. What 1950s child psychology largely supported this? John B. Watson's behaviorist framework, which dominated American child-rearing thinking from the 20s through the 50s, held that children were shaped entirely by conditioning, reward and punishment, stimulus and response. Physical punishment was a clear, immediate response to undesired behavior. It was operationally elegant. Whether it produced internal moral development or simply external compliance was a question that behaviorism was not structurally interested in asking. The long-term research on corporal punishment's psychological effect was not yet developed in the 1950s. That research would come in the following decades and would eventually produce a substantial body of evidence linking physical punishment to increased aggression, diminished mental health outcomes, and impaired parent-child relationships, effects that operated regardless of how the punishment was framed or how calmly it was administered. The 1950s didn't have this data, and operated instead on a consensus so thorough it didn't register as a consensus at all. It was just what you did. The children raised in this way grew up, had children of their own, and faced, for the first time in American parenting history, a genuine cultural debate about whether the thing their parents had done to them was correct. Some continued the practice, others stopped, sometimes with the slightly stunned quality of people who have realized mid-sentence that they are saying something their parents said and have to decide whether to finish the sentence. The stopping was its own kind of reckoning, quiet and largely private, conducted one family at a time. The 1950s mental hospital was less a place of healing and more a place of storage, somewhere to put people whose behaviour disturbed the social fabric enough that their families or communities could no longer manage them. The criteria for admission were broad and included, for women, things like excessive talkativeness, refusal to perform household duties, and being gay. Once inside, patients were subject to treatments that included insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy administered without anesthesia, hydrotherapy, and the aforementioned lobotomy. Leaving required the cooperation of whoever had signed you in. The asylum was not a last resort. For some families, it was a first solution. The American state hospital system at its peak in the 1950s housed approximately 550,000 patients, more than at any point before or since. The institutions were enormous, understaffed, underfunded, and operating under a broad mandate to manage behavioural and psychiatric difference with the tools available, which were few, and the ones that worked were not always distinguished clearly from the ones that didn't. You entered through a process that required, in most states, only the agreement of a family member and a physician. You left through a process that required the agreement of the institution. The asymmetry was the system. You're a 31-year-old woman in 1953. Your husband has signed the paperwork. The reasons he has given to the admitting physician include emotional outbursts, refusal to maintain the household, failure to perform conjugal duties, and what he describes as inappropriate obsession with a woman neighbour. The physician has noted homosexual tendencies in the chart. You are admitted to the state hospital on a Friday. You do not know how long you will be there. There is no clear answer to that question. The question is not yours to ask. Insulin coma therapy, introduced in the 1930s and still practiced widely in the 50s, involved administering large doses of insulin to induce a hypoglycemic coma, then reviving the patient with glucose, a cycle repeated several times per week for weeks or months. The theory was that the coma reset something in the brain. The evidence base for this was thin and contested even within psychiatry, but the practice continued because it produced a visible, dramatic response, and because, in the absence of effective treatments, doing something felt better than doing nothing, for the staff at least. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, was administered in 1950s institutions routinely and without anesthesia, which meant the patient was fully conscious when the current was applied and experienced the full physical convulsion. The technique produced fractures, vertebral fractures, broken bones from the force of the seizure, with some regularity. Practitioners knew this. The anesthesia that would eventually make ECT a safer and more targeted procedure was not yet standard practice. Patients who received ECT without anesthesia in the 1950s described the experience in terms that the staff's clinical notes did not reflect. The asylum in the 1950s was also, for gay men and women, a site of coercive conversion. Homosexuality appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a mental disorder until 1973. This classification provided the medical legitimacy for institutionalization, aversion therapy, pairing images of same-sex attraction with electric shocks or nausea-inducing drugs, and surgical interventions including lobotomy. The goal was to produce heterosexual behavior. The actual outcomes were a range of devastation, from patients who reported subsequent misery in managed heterosexual lives to patients who did not recover recognizable selves at all. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s would empty the state hospitals, releasing hundreds of thousands of patients into communities that were largely unprepared to receive them. That the hospital was an inadequate solution was correct. That the communities were ready was not. But in the 1950s, before that reckoning, the hospital sat on the edge of every American community as a destination, a warning, and a very efficient method of disappearing people whose difference had become inconvenient. The gate opened one way more smoothly than the other. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it quite that plainly. Somewhere in the middle of ordinary 1950s life, between the new Chevrolet advertisement and the church bulletin, you might find a catalogue for home bomb shelters. Marketed like any other home improvement product, backyard installation available, pre-stocked with canned goods, water containers, a hand-crank radio, and enough space for the nuclear family unit to wait out the end of the world in a concrete box underground. Some families built them. Most didn't. The catalogues kept arriving anyway, cheerfully illustrated, vaguely impossible, as though the correct response to the threat of nuclear annihilation was better purchasing decisions and a well-organized pantry. The federal government's civil defense apparatus in the 1950s operated on a premise that required extraordinary optimism to sustain, that nuclear war was survivable, that ordinary Americans could protect themselves with reasonable preparation, and that the difference between a family that made it through a nuclear strike and one that didn't was primarily a matter of advanced planning and the right supplies in the basement. This premise was necessary. Without it, the entire civil defense program collapsed into absurdity, so it was maintained with considerable energy and distributed through pamphlets, films, public service announcements, and yes, the home shelter industry that grew up in its shadow. You sit at your kitchen table in 1958 with a catalogue from a company called Peace O' Mind Shelters, and you page through it with the slightly surreal quality of a document that wants to be a home improvement brochure and keeps bumping against its own subject matter. There are floor plans. The economy model, 8 by 8 feet. Concrete block, rated for a certain distance from a certain yield detonation, suitable for a family of 4. The deluxe model adds a chemical toilet and a filtered ventilation system. The Family Plus extends to 12 feet and includes a fold-out sleeping platform. All models are illustrated with diagrams showing the family unit arranged comfortably inside. Mother, father, 2 children, seated or lying down, looking calm. The supplies list is its own exercise in cheerful futility. 2 weeks of canned food, water containers, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio to receive emergency broadcast system instructions, a first aid kit, which would be relevant for minor injuries and not for much else in the scenario under consideration, a deck of cards, suggested in some guides to manage the psychological dimension of waiting underground for 2 weeks, while the surface became temporarily uninhabitable, playing cards for the nuclear aftermath. Someone thought about the psychological dimension and concluded the correct response was go fish. Approximately 1.5 million American families built some form of home shelter between the late 1950s and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, a number that sounds significant until you consider it against the roughly 50 million American households in the period. The majority read the catalogues and didn't build. The cost was substantial. A basic shelter ran several $1,000s, a meaningful sum in 1958, but the more important barrier was probably something harder to articulate: the recognition, somewhere beneath the civil defense optimism, that a family-sized concrete box was not actually a solution to the thing it was being sold as a solution to. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 was when the abstraction became briefly, terrifyingly concrete. For 13 days, the country existed in a state of genuine nuclear suspense, and the shelters that had been built were suddenly not theoretical. Families who had them stocked them. Families who hadn't built them wondered, with a specific flavour of regret, whether they should have. Then the crisis resolved, and the shelters went back to being basements, and the catalogue went back to being something you found at the back of the magazine rack, and the decade resumed its practiced posture of calm, and nobody said out loud how close it had been, because saying it out loud was not really how the 1950s preferred to operate. When Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, television cameras filmed him only from the waist up. His hips, the network had decided, were too dangerous for broadcast. This was not a joke. Parents held meetings, ministers gave sermons, congressional hearings were proposed, rock and roll, this collision of rhythm, and blues, gospel, country, and barely restrained physical energy was understood by a wide cross-section of American adults to be a genuine moral threat, not a metaphor for one, an actual immediate danger to the country's youth, primarily because it was music created by black artists and enthusiastically adopted by white teenagers, and the 1950s knew exactly what to do with that. You're 44 years old in 1956 and your daughter has put a 45 on the record player, and what is coming out of it is not anything you recognise as music in any prior sense of the word. It is loud, and it has a beat that is physical before it is melodic, and the man singing it sounds like something is happening to him that should probably happen privately. Your daughter is moving in response to it in ways that you're going to need a few minutes to process. You walk to the record player and lift the needle. She looks at you with an expression you will be seeing frequently for the next several years. You look at the label. It says Elvis Presley. You put it in the trash. The moral panic around rock and roll was not manufactured by a single institution, though several tried to claim credit for it. It arose organically from a genuine collision, the music that black Americans had been making for decades. Rhythm and blues, gospel, jump blues, boogie-woogie had crossed into white teenage consumption in a way that the culture's segregationist infrastructure had failed to prevent. Radio was the vector. Alan Freed, a white disc jockey in Cleveland, began playing rhythm and blues for a mixed-race audience in 1951 and called it rock and roll, a term borrowed from black vernacular, and the audience grew with a speed that alarmed people on multiple fronts. The alarm was about several things simultaneously, and the people alarmed were not always honest about which thing bothered them most. There was a stated concern about sexuality. The music was too physical, the dancing too suggestive, the relationship between the beat and the body too explicit for a culture that had constructed elaborate systems for not acknowledging that young people had bodies with impulses. There was a stated concern about juvenile delinquency. Rock and roll concerts had produced some incidents of rowdy behaviour that the press covered as evidence of systemic corruption. And beneath both stated concerns was the unstated one. This was black music, and the teenagers dancing to it were crossing a cultural line that the decade had worked very hard to maintain. Record-burning events were organised. Radio stations banned certain songs. The Catholic Youth Organisation campaigned against rock and roll concerts. Several southern states introduced legislation targeting the music. Senate hearings examined links between rock and roll, juvenile delinquency, and communist influence, the suggestion being that the music was a Soviet cultural weapon designed to corrupt American youth, which in retrospect is one of the more creative theories the 1950s produced. Elvis was not the originator of any of this. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Big Joe Turner, the black artists who created the music were simultaneously making it and being systematically locked out of the mainstream commercial returns it generated. White cover versions of their songs, recorded by artists like Pat Boone and aimed at white radio, outsold the originals. The industry extracted the music from its creators with practiced efficiency, the same way it had always done, while the culture panicked about the music's influence on its children. The children, meanwhile, found the music anyway, through the radio late at night, through the record store, through the older cousin's collection, and carried it with them into the decade that followed, where it became the soundtrack of everything the 1950s had been trying to prevent. To be gay in the 1950s was to live in a country that classified your existence as a mental illness, a criminal act, and a communist security risk, often simultaneously. Homosexuality appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a disorder. It was prosecuted under sodomy laws that sent people to prison. It was used by McCarthy's investigators as a disqualifier for federal employment, the lavender scare running parallel to the red one. And yet gay life existed anyway, in coded languages, in bars raided regularly by police, in carefully maintained double lives, in letters written and never sent, in friendships that were more than friendships in a decade that refused to let them be anything else. You're 26 years old in 1954, and you have constructed your life with the precision of someone who knows exactly which walls are load-bearing. At work, you are affable and professional and slightly private in ways that nobody has yet found suspicious. At home, you're careful about what you leave visible, careful about who you invite, careful about what you say on the telephone because phone's not private, and neighbours are observant, and the consequences of a wrong word landing in the wrong ear are not abstract. You're not hiding exactly. The word implies that what you are is something to be ashamed of, and you have had years to work through that particular argument with yourself. You are managing. There is a difference, and it matters to you, even if the outcome looks the same from the outside. The lavender scare ran parallel to the red scare with almost identical machinery. In 1950, the State Department fired 91 employees identified as homosexual, framing the purge in national security language. Gay people were susceptible to blackmail by Soviet agents, the argument went, and therefore constituted a security risk. The logic was circular in a way that nobody in authority chose to examine. The blackmail risk existed because homosexuality was criminalized and stigmatized, a situation the government was actively maintaining while simultaneously using as justification for further persecution. The circularity was the point. Between 1947 and 1950, more federal employees were fired for suspected homosexuality than for suspected communist affiliation. The bar was the primary institution of gay social life in 1950s America, and it operated under constant siege. Police raids were routine. Officers would arrive, demand identification, arrest anyone in gender non-conforming clothing, and charge patrons with disorderly conduct, public indecency, or simply being present in a disorderly establishment. The names of those arrested were frequently published in local newspapers, which was often the most damaging consequence. The arrest itself could be managed, but the name in print, visible to employers and neighbours and family, could not. The Stonewall Inn in New York was a mob-owned operation, partly because legitimate businesses couldn't afford the association, and partly because mob connections provided the advance warning of raids that kept the bar viable. When the patrons of Stonewall finally fought back in 1969, the uprising drew on nearly 2 decades of accumulated indignity. The Mattachine Society, founded in Los Angeles in 1950 by Harry Hay, was one of the first homophile organizations in America, a term chosen deliberately over the more clinical and stigmatized language of the day. It operated cautiously in the cell structure of communist organizing that Hay had learned as a former party member, because caution was survival. Members used pseudonyms. Meetings were held in private homes. The organization's early goal was not rights in the political sense. That framing would come later, but simply the radical act of gay people meeting each other, recognizing a shared humanity, and existing in organized form in a culture that preferred they not exist at all. What the decade could not prevent, despite its considerable institutional efforts, was private life. The letters written and kept in locked boxes. The relationships conducted in the gaps between official life. The networks of friendship and love that function below the visible surface of the culture, maintaining themselves through discretion and mutual protection, waiting, with a patience born of necessity, for a world that might eventually accommodate them. That world was coming. In 1954, it was not here yet, but the people waiting for it were real and present and very much alive. The 1950s automobile was an engineering masterpiece and a rolling death trap, and Americans loved it without reservation. No seatbelts required, no seatbelts installed usually, no padded dashboards, no headrests, no crumple zones, just gleaming chrome, tail fins that served no aerodynamic purpose whatsoever, a speedometer that went up to 120 miles per hour, and a steering column pointed directly at the driver's chest. Traffic fatalities were staggering, tens of thousands per year. The response from automakers was largely to make the cars bigger and more beautiful. Safety was considered a buzzkill. Ralph Nader wouldn't publish Unsafe at any speed until 1965, and Detroit's initial response was to have him investigated. You are behind the wheel of a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, and it is, without any serious competition, the most beautiful object you have ever personally operated. The chrome catches the afternoon light with the generosity of something that knows it is being admired. The body is long and low and sculpted in ways that suggest speed without requiring it. The tail fins, which Harley Earl at General Motors introduced and every other manufacturer immediately scrambled to imitate, rise from the rear quarters like the wings of something that has decided gravity is a suggestion. You merge onto the new highway and press the accelerator, and the V8 opens up beneath you with a sound that is somewhere between a purr and a threat. and the speedometer needle swings to the right with a confidence you find completely reassuring. The American automobile industry in the 1950s was a triumph of design and a catastrophe of priorities. The design came from studios where men like Harley Earl treated cars as sculpture, commissioning clay models and full-size mock-ups, and iterating towards shapes that had no particular engineering justification, but produced, in the observer, a physical response somewhere between desire and awe. The tail fin was borrowed from the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter plane, which Earl had seen at a wartime preview show and decided should immediately influence passenger vehicle aesthetics. Whether it made the car faster, safer, or more fuel efficient was not the question being asked. It made the car look like the future, which in 1957 was sufficient. The safety question was not being asked because nobody with commercial interest in the answer wanted to ask it. Traffic fatalities in the United States in the 1950s ran between 36,000 and 38,000 per year, roughly equivalent to a significant war, distributed across weekends and holidays and ordinary Tuesday commutes. The physical causes were well understood. Unpadded steel dashboards that met passengers at speed, steering columns designed as rigid spears aimed at the driver's chest, windshields of pre-lamination glass that shattered into large razor-edged pieces, no door structures designed to absorb impact, no seat belts, because seat belts implied that the car might stop suddenly in a way that required the occupant to be secured. The implication was bad for sales. Cornell University's Automotive Crash Injury Research Program had been documenting the mechanics of crash injuries since the late 1940s, producing data that clearly identified the specific design features killing people. The research was available. Detroit read it and continued designing. The industry's position, held with remarkable consistency, was that safety features would imply danger, and that implying danger would suppress consumer enthusiasm. This was almost certainly true in the short term. What it produced in practice was a generation of vehicles that looked magnificent and killed their occupants with the reliability of poor engineering and denial. Ralph Nader's 1965 book focused on the Chevrolet Corvair specifically, but indicted the industry generally, using engineering analysis and crash data to demonstrate that the deaths were not accidents in the fatalistic sense. They were predictable, preventable outcomes of deliberate design choices. General Motors' response was to hire private investigators to dig up personal information on Nader, follow him, and attempt to find something compromising. The Senate held hearings. The GM president apologized. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act passed in 1966. Seat belts became mandatory equipment. The cars got slightly less beautiful and considerably less lethal, and the trade, viewed from any rational distance, was obviously correct. It just took the decade and a half of the 1950s to establish what the problem was, primarily because the problem was wrapped in chrome, and it was very hard to be angry at something that looked like that. Before, the 1950s teenager wasn't really a social category. You were a child and then you went to work, or you got married and you became an adult. The post-war economic boom changed that. Suddenly families had disposable income, high school enrollment expanded dramatically, and an entire cohort of young people found themselves in a strange suspended state. Too old for childhood, not yet required to be adults, with spending money, free time, and absolutely no idea what to do with either. The market noticed immediately. The teenager was born in large part as a consumer category, and the adults spent the rest of the decade trying to figure out what they'd created. High school attendance in America had been climbing since the 20s, but the post-war years accelerated it dramatically. In 1940, roughly 50% of American teenagers attended high school. By 1960, it was closer to 90%. This meant that for the first time in American history, the majority of young people between the ages of 14 and 18 were spending their days in the same buildings, organised by age, developing social structures and cultural reference points entirely separate from the adult world around them. You were sorted by year, tracked by grade, evaluated by peer approval systems that had no adult equivalent and no adult oversight. You were, in the most technical sense, developing a subculture. Nobody had asked for this, it happened anyway. The market's response was swift and total. By the mid-1950s, American teenagers represented an estimated $9 to $10 billion in annual purchasing power, an enormous sum in a decade when a new car cost $2,000. They bought records, they bought clothes, they bought movie tickets, cosmetics, and the specific accessories associated with belonging to whatever peer category they were navigating. Companies that had previously aimed exclusively at adult consumers began producing teenage versions of everything: teenage magazines, teenage radio programming, teenage television shows. American Bandstand debuted nationally in 1957, broadcasting daily from Philadelphia, teenagers dancing to current records, rated by teenage judges, watched by teenagers across the country, who used it to calibrate what was current and what was not. It was, functionally, a daily national briefing for the teenage social consensus. You're 15 in 1958, and you have a specific relationship with your blue jeans that your parents do not fully understand and have given up trying to regulate. The jeans are rolled at the cuff to a precise measurement. You wear them with a white t-shirt and a particular pair of shoes, and together these items constitute a statement that is legible to every other 15-year-old in your school and opaque to every adult, which is exactly the point. The uniform is the argument. We are a category. We are distinct. We have our own things, and you don't get to decide what they are. The adult response ranged from commercial enthusiasm to genuine alarm. Juvenile delinquency became the decade's great moral panic, layered beneath and alongside the rock and roll panic, because the two were understood to be connected. Senate subcommittees investigated comic books as sources of juvenile corruption. Psychiatrist Frederick Vertum published Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, arguing that comic books caused homosexuality and criminal behavior in children, and was taken seriously. Movies like Rebel Without a Cause and Blackboard Jungle depicted teenage alienation and classroom disorder with a realism that shocked adult audiences and electrified teenage ones, who recognized something the adults producing the films might not have fully intended: themselves. What the decade had actually created in the teenager was the first generation of Americans with both the economic power and the social space to develop a distinct identity before adulthood absorbed them. The implications of that would unfold through the 1960s in ways the 1950s could not have fully predicted and would not, given the choice, have approved. But the choice was gone. The teenager existed. The market had made them real, and the culture had given them time, and what they did with both was entirely their own. Before the consequences of nuclear testing were fully understood, or rather, before those consequences could no longer be ignored, radiation had a certain novelty appeal in 1950s America. Schools received uranium ore samples as educational tools. Toy stores sold Gilbert U-238 atomic energy lab kits, which contained actual radioactive materials and were marketed for children aged 10 and up. Watches with radium-painted dials were fashionable. Health spas in the American West advertised the benefits of radon exposure. People drove into the desert to watch atomic tests detonated at the Nevada test site, bringing picnics, setting up lawn chairs, and watching the mushroom clouds with the casual wonder of people who had not yet been fully informed of the thing they were watching. The atomic bomb had ended the war, and the 1950s had decided, with the particular optimism of a decade that needed something to believe in, that what ended the war would also power the future. Nuclear energy was going to make electricity too cheap to meter, This phrase was actually used in public by the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1954 with a straight face, and it was reported without laughter. Nuclear medicine would cure cancer. Nuclear-powered aircraft were being seriously designed. Nuclear-powered cargo ships were built. The atom was not a weapon, it was a tool, and the tool was going to be wonderful, and the enthusiasm for this idea was real and widespread and required, for its maintenance, a certain selective relationship with what was already known about radiation exposure. You're a child in 1952, and your science teacher has brought in a cloud chamber, a small device that makes the tracks of ionizing radiation visible as white streaks through supersaturated alcohol vapor. The class gathers around it and watches the streaks appear and vanish, and your teacher explains that this is radiation, always present, moving through everything including you, and this information is delivered in the tone of someone sharing a fascinating natural fact rather than an unsettling one. The cloud chamber is exciting, radiation is exciting, everything about the atom is exciting, and the country's excitement is genuine, and nobody is lying to you exactly, because the people doing the explaining believe what they're saying, and what they're saying leaves out quite a lot. The Nevada test site, established in 1951, conducted above-ground nuclear detonations through the 1950s at a pace and proximity to civilian populations that later evaluations would classify as extraordinarily reckless. More than 100 above-ground tests were conducted before the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty ended them in 1963. The town of St. George, Utah, approximately 130 miles from the test site, was repeatedly downwind of detonations. Residents watched the blast from their porches. Fallout drifted over the town in clouds that left visible residue on cars and clothing. Civil defense officials told residents to stay indoors briefly after tests and then return to normal activity. The officials' reassurances were consistent and confident, and it would eventually become clear, not well supported by what was already known internally about fallout exposure. The downwinders, the people who lived in the path of fallout from Nevada testing, began reporting elevated cancer rates, livestock deaths, and clusters of illness in their communities through the late 50s and 60s. The government's response was initially denial, then study, then slow, contested acknowledgement. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which provided payments to downwinders who developed specific cancers, was not passed until 1990, nearly 4 decades after the exposures. By then, many of the people affected were dead, which simplified the compensation mathematics considerably. The Gilbert Atomic Energy Lab was discontinued in 1951 after 1 year of production, quietly withdrawn from shelves without public explanation. The radium dial watch industry had already produced in the 1920s and 30s the radium girls, factory workers who painted watch dials with radium-based paint, were instructed to point their brushes with their lips and died in significant numbers from radiation-induced cancers in a legal case that established foundational principles of occupational health law. The 1950s knew this history. It filed it under a different category than the exciting present, which was nuclear optimism, which was a different thing entirely, at least until it wasn't. In the 1950s, fitting in wasn't just socially advisable, it was ideologically mandated. The organisation man went to his organisation job in his organisation suit, and came home to his organisation house in his organisation suburb, and the weight of that conformity was distributed so evenly across the entire social fabric that most people couldn't feel it pressing down. To be different in how you dressed, what you believed, who you loved, what music you played, what questions you asked, was not just unusual. It was suspicious. Suspicious in the McCarthyist sense. suspicious in the way that got people called in for conversations they hadn't requested. The collective exhale of the 1960s counterculture was, in large part, a generation that had grown up under this pressure finally, furiously releasing it. William H. White published The Organization Man in 1956, and the book's reception said something about the decade. It became a bestseller, which meant that a significant portion of the American public recognized themselves in White's description of men who had traded individual ambition for institutional belonging, who had learned to sand down the edges of their personalities to fit the corporate culture that employed them, and who had accepted, largely without examination, that the group's judgment was more reliable than their own. White was not entirely condemnatory. He understood the appeal of belonging, of the security and identity that institutional membership provided. He was simply naming something that the decade preferred to leave unnamed, and the fact that people bought the book in large numbers suggested they had been waiting for the name. You work at a large corporation in 1955. You wear a grey suit and a white shirt and a dark tie, as does every other man on your floor, and the visual uniformity is not enforced by policy, but by the social consequences of deviation, which are swift and permanent. You have a colleague who came in once in a brown suit, and the word eccentric attached to him within the week, and has not detached since. You do not wear a brown suit. You do not hold strong opinions about anything at the office that you have not first assessed against the room. You have learned to read the temperature before you speak, and to speak only when the temperature is favourable, and to adjust your expressed views accordingly. And this skill feels, when you are honest with yourself late at night, less like professional wisdom and more like something you are doing to yourself that you do not have a name for yet. The suburbs enforced conformity through proximity and visibility. Your lawn was public, your car was public, your children's behaviour in the neighbourhood was public. The performance of domestic normalcy, the maintained house, the mowed lawn, the well-dressed family visible at church on Sunday, was the neighbourhood's currency, and falling behind on it generated a specific social consequence. The quiet withdrawal of standing that was never formally announced and did not require a formal cause. You didn't have to do anything dramatic to lose your place. You just had to stop performing, and eventually the performance gap became visible, and the gap became the story about you. The Beats, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, and the communities gathered around them in San Francisco and New York were the decade's most visible dissidents, and the culture's response to them illustrated the mechanism perfectly. They were not arrested for their writing mostly, they were ridiculed, called dirty, irresponsible, immature, un-American. Ginsberg's Howl was tried for obscenity in 1957, with the judge eventually finding it not obscene. But the trial was itself the punishment, the message that certain kinds of expression would be met with institutional force. The Beats named what the decade was doing to people, and were told in return that they were the problem. The counterculture that erupted in the 1960s was not a spontaneous generation. It was built by people who had spent their formative years inside the conformity machine, absorbing its pressures, learning its rules, and developing quietly the refusal that would eventually become audible. Every teenager listening to rock and roll under the covers at midnight, every housewife reading Friedan with a particular shock of recognition, every gay man maintaining his double life with exhausting precision, they were all collecting what the decade cost them, and at some point the collection became a reckoning. The 1960s was not something that happened to the 1950s, it was something the 1950s made. After the war, Americans got married young and had children immediately and in quantity, and the culture treated this as not just normal, but morally correct. Having children was patriotic. Having many children was evidence of health, stability, and proper values. Women who chose not to have children were viewed with suspicion, pity, or both. Women who had children and found the experience complicated were expected to keep that complication entirely private. The baby boom produced 76 million Americans between 1946 and 1964, a demographic wave that would shape every institution it moved through. It also produced a great deal of very tired mothers who were not allowed to say so. Between 1946 and 1964, American women gave birth to approximately 76 million children, an average birth rate significantly above that of the pre-war and post-war decades on either side of the boom. The mathematics of this are simple enough. Men came home from the war, couples reunited or formed, and the deferred life, the house, the children, the normal future that the Depression and the war had postponed, began at speed. But the numbers alone don't capture the cultural pressure that surrounded the choice, which was not experienced by most women as a choice in any meaningful sense of the word. You're 23 in 1951, married for 14 months, and at your mother's Sunday dinner your aunt has already asked 3 times when you and your husband are going to start a family, and by start a family she means specifically, when are you going to have children? Because you are already a family, technically. But that framing has not caught on, and you've given up trying to introduce it. Your neighbour had her 3rd child last spring, and the neighbourhood brought casseroles. Your college roommate is pregnant with her 2nd, and her letters describe the experience with a contentment that you read and reread, trying to determine whether it is genuine. Your doctor asked at your last annual appointment whether you were trying, the word carrying its full weight of expectation in 3 unremarkable letters. You are trying. You have been trying. The trying is its own specific pressure, layered beneath the general pressure, because fertility is also not a private matter in the 1950s. The prenatalist culture of the decade operated through every available channel. Popular magazines ran features on large families as evidence of American vitality, photographs of smiling mothers surrounded by children, captions emphasizing abundance and energy. Religious institutions, both Catholic and Protestant, promoted large families as spiritual virtue. Government housing policy favored families with children. The GI Bill's educational and housing benefits were structured around the assumption of the breadwinner plus dependents family unit, making the nuclear family not just culturally normative, but financially incentivized. What was not culturally accommodated was the texture of the experience on the inside. Postpartum depression was not a recognized clinical category. In routine obstetric care, women who experienced it were told they were adjusting, or that they needed to try harder, or given Milltown and sent home. The isolation of raising multiple small children in a suburban house with minimal adult contact through the day was not a recognized stressor. It was the life you had chosen, and the choosing precluded complaint. The physical demands of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and infant care cycling across closely spaced children over a decade were real and substantial, and acknowledged primarily in the cheerful framing of women's magazine features that described exhaustion as a small price for the privilege. The boom children, born into a culture that had wanted them very specifically and in very large numbers, would grow up to be the most studied generation in American history, their every developmental stage tracked by sociologists, marketers, and eventually by themselves with a degree of self-examination that their parents, who had not been encouraged toward introspection, found occasionally bewildering. The generation that the 1950s produced to fulfill its ideals would spend the following decades questioning nearly every one of them, which was, in the particular logic of history, exactly what you might expect from people raised in a house where certain questions were never asked. In the 1950s, a woman's face was a project, a daily construction site managed with cold cream, setting lotion, powder, lipstick, and the particular kind of practiced cheerfulness that suggested effort without appearing to require any. Beauty advertisements of the era didn't suggest products. They issued quiet verdicts. Your pores were a problem. Your complexion needed management. Your eyebrows required professional attention. Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden had built empires on the premise that the natural female face was a rough draft requiring substantial revision. And the revision was never quite finished. There was always another product, another deficiency just identified, another standard slightly out of reach. You sit at your vanity table in 1953. The vanity table is standard furniture, a desk with a mirror, because the maintenance of your appearance is understood to be a domestic activity with a designated workspace, and you work through the sequence. Cleansing cream to remove the previous day. Toner to close the pores that the cleansing cream has opened, because the industry has a product for each half of every cycle it creates. Moisturizer, because the skin requires constant hydration, or it will age visibly, and visible aging is a category error in the 1950s. Foundation, matched to your skin tone through a process involving the back of your wrist and a fluorescent light, and a saleswoman at the department store counter whose own face is a demonstration of the full product line. Powder over the foundation. Blush applied at an angle that your magazine has described as corrective of your particular facial structure. Lipstick, which comes in a range of reds and pinks calibrated to the season, the occasion, and the specific message you intend to convey. Mascara, applied with a small brush dampened on the tongue. Eyebrows, shaped according to the current approved arch, which changes enough between years to require annual recalibration. The beauty industry's post-war expansion was extraordinary. Between 1945 and 1960, the American cosmetics industry roughly tripled in revenue. New product categories emerged continuously. The industry didn't wait for consumer demand and then supply it. It manufactured the need and then offered the remedy, a cycle that required constant identification of new inadequacies. Dry skin was an inadequacy. Oily skin was a different inadequacy. Large pores, small lips, uneven complexion, thin lashes, the specific grey cast of tired skin, each one a named problem with a corresponding retail solution, described in advertisement copy that had studied the language of medical authority closely enough to approximate it without technically making claims the Federal Trade Commission could challenge. Television was the decade's new beauty medium, and its demands were specific. The camera read makeup differently than natural light, which meant the women who appeared on television, and increasingly, the women watching them, needed to recalibrate their approaches. Max Factor's Pancake Foundation, originally developed for film, became a television staple. The groomed, consistent face that read clearly on a small black and white screen became the aspirational image distributed into every American living room nightly. You watched women on television, and they looked a specific way, and the products that produced that look were advertised during the commercial breaks, and the loop was complete and efficient and ran itself. What was not available in the 1950s beauty industry was anything that acknowledged aging as acceptable. Anti-aging was not yet the explicit product category it would become, that language would sharpen in later decades, but the cultural infrastructure for it was fully in place. Women over 40 who showed the physical evidence of being over 40 were available as cautionary examples in magazine features. The cosmetics industry offered products for mature skin with a framing that made clear mature skin was a problem to be managed rather than a stage to be inhabited. Helena Rubinstein was 73 in 1953, and she ran the company with the vigour of someone who had personally decided aging did not apply to her, and she sold that decision as a product, and women bought it, because the alternative, accepting what time did to a face in a decade that had no tolerance for the result, was not presented as an available option. In the course of 1950s nuclear testing, the United States military placed thousands of animals, pigs, sheep, dogs, horses, at measured distances from nuclear detonations to study the effects of blast heat and radiation. The pigs, in particular, were dressed in uniforms to study how fabric affected burn patterns. Navy ships were loaded with animals and positioned near test sites. Some survived, most didn't. The experiments were classified, conducted at the Nevada test site in the Pacific Proving Grounds, and described in government documents in the measured clinical language of scientific inquiry. They were also, viewed plainly, something else entirely. Operation Crossroads, conducted at Bikini Atoll in 1946, positioned 200 vessels in the lagoon, many stocked with animals, goats, pigs, rats, to measure the biological effects of nuclear detonation at various distances and configurations. The animals were placed in their positions, secured so they could not move, and the bomb was detonated. The data collected was detailed and useful from a certain scientific standpoint, and it established the basic framework for the biological effects research that continued through the 1950s at the Nevada test site with increasing sophistication and expanding populations of test subjects. You will not read about any of this in your newspaper in 1953. The testing program is classified, the animals are classified, the biological effects research is classified. What you will read in controlled releases from the Atomic Energy Commission is that the tests are proceeding safely, that civil defense information is being gathered for the protection of the American public, and that the program represents the nation's commitment to security in the nuclear age. You will look at photographs of mushroom clouds over the Nevada desert and feel, in the particular way the decade has taught you to feel about these things, a mixture of pride and faint, unnameable unease that you will set aside because the experts are in charge and the experts are reassuring. The pig experiments at the Nevada test site in the early 1950s were among the more documented biological programs, and the ones that most directly confronted the fact of the research with something recognizable. Pigs were chosen because pig skin is physiologically similar to human skin, which meant that burn data from pigs was directly applicable to projections about human casualties. The pigs were dressed in US military uniform standard issue fabric to determine whether the uniform provided any protective effect against thermal radiation. Some were dressed, some were not, and the differential burn data informed military uniform specifications for nuclear environments. The pigs that survived the initial blast were observed for radiation sickness progression. The data was thorough. The dogs used in the Nevada tests served different research purposes, primarily radiation exposure at sublethal doses, tracking the progression of radiation sickness, blood count changes, and long-term health outcomes in animals that survived the initial exposure. These programs were conducted by military veterinarians and medical researchers who kept meticulous records and whose professional papers occasionally appear in declassified archives with the same calm, technical tone as any other medical research of the period. The animals had identification numbers. Their conditions were monitored at regular intervals. The conclusions drawn from their illness and death were applied to civil defense planning and military medical preparation. The ethical framework governing animal research in the 1950s was not the framework that developed in subsequent decades. There was no institutional review process comparable to what exists now. The military research context operated under national security classification that placed it outside ordinary scrutiny. The people conducting the research were not, by their own account and by the standards of their time, doing anything wrong. They were gathering data necessary to understand a weapon that existed and would be used if it came to that, and understanding the weapon's effects on biological tissue required biological tissue. The animals were the most efficient available source. What the decade could not do, what the classification and the clinical language and the national security framing combined to prevent, was a public accounting of what the research looked like outside the technical reports. Pigs in military uniforms positioned at measured distances from nuclear detonations, wearing the clothes of the soldiers the experiment was designed to protect. It is, held plainly in the mind, an image that resists the framing the decade preferred. The 1950s did not hold it plainly. It filed it under national security and moved on, as it did with a great many things that were easier to manage in the dark. In the 1950s, getting divorced didn't just end a marriage, it ended your social standing, your reputation, your children's prospects, and your own sense of who you were allowed to be going forward. Divorce was technically legal in most states, but practically a declaration of personal failure so complete that many people, mostly women, simply stayed. Stayed in marriages that were cold or cruel, or simply exhausting in ways that had no acceptable name. Judges in fault-based divorce states required you to prove wrongdoing. Neighbours whispered. Churches weighed in. The divorced woman was a cautionary tale, not a free person. The men usually remarried quickly. The women usually didn't get to. The legal architecture of divorce in the 1950s was designed, whether deliberately or functionally, to make leaving difficult. Most states operated under fault-based divorce law, which required one spouse to prove legally recognized grounds: adultery, cruelty, abandonment, or in some states, specific additional categories like habitual drunkenness or felony conviction. The requirement to prove fault meant that ending a marriage required either genuine documented wrongdoing or a theatrical production of it. Couples who wanted to divorce by mutual agreement would sometimes stage evidence, with the husband arranging to be found in a compromising position by a hired witness, or the spouses manufacturing a paper record of cruelty that satisfied the legal standard without reflecting the actual reason they wanted to separate, which was frequently simply that they had made a mistake and the marriage was not working, and they wished to stop. You have been married for 11 years in 1957, and the marriage has been over, in all the ways that matter, for approximately 6 of them. There was no single event, no dramatic betrayal, no documented cruelty. There was the slow accumulation of 2 people who had made a decision at 22 that turned out at 33 to have been made with insufficient information about who they were going to become. Your husband is not unkind. He is absent in the way the decade produces absent husbands, and you have filled the absence with the children and the house and the social calendar and the church committee work, and the filling has worked, mostly, for years. But you are 33 and you can see quite clearly what 43 looks like from here, and 43 looks like this extended, and you cannot do this. You cannot, however, say this to anyone. The vocabulary for your situation does not exist in polite company. You can say your husband drinks. If he drinks, that is a recognized category with a recognized social response. You can say he struck you. If he strikes you, though the evidence threshold and the social sympathy are both lower than they should be. But you cannot say, we are 2 fundamentally incompatible people who have been performing a marriage for 6 years, and I would like to stop performing it. That is not a ground. That is not even a sentence the decade has a response to. The divorced woman in 1958 occupies a specific social position that is neither fully inside nor outside respectable society. She's invited to fewer dinner parties because dinner parties are organised around couples and her presence disrupts the arithmetic. She's watched around married men with a particular attention that implies she's a vector of risk, the logic being that a woman who failed at marriage is available in ways that threaten the marriages around her, a logic that says more about the presumed fragility of 1950s marriages than it intends to. Her children carry the category at school. Other mothers note it. She manages. She gets a job, or expands the job she had. Because her financial situation has changed significantly, in ways nobody in her social circle is willing to discuss directly. She finds that working suits her in ways she didn't anticipate, because it provides what the marriage and the suburb never did. The experience of being evaluated on the quality of her work rather than the quality of her domestic performance. She is, at 34, freer than she has been in 11 years, and the freedom is real and costs something every day, and she would not trade it, and she does not say this to anyone because the decade is not ready for it. But she knows, and knowing, it turns out, is where the next decade starts. Here's the thing about the 1950s that makes it so uniquely fascinating to look back on. An enormous amount of genuinely awful stuff was happening, and the dominant cultural posture was optimistic, tidy, and relentlessly forward-facing. Beneath the gleaming kitchen appliances and the manicured lawns and the Ed Sullivan Show, there was the terror of nuclear annihilation, the violence of segregation, the suppression of women, the medicalization of inconvenient personalities, and the quiet desperation of a generation that had survived a war and a depression, and arrived at prosperity still carrying everything they'd endured. The 1950s didn't resolve those things. It just covered them in Formica and called it progress. The Formica was excellent, to be fair. The 1950s delivered prosperity to a wider range of Americans than any previous decade in the country's history. The post-war economic expansion was real and substantial. Wages rose, home ownership rates rose, the middle class expanded in ways that genuinely changed the daily material conditions of millions of families. If you were white, male, and positioned to benefit from the GI Bill and the post-war labour market, the 1950s delivered on most of what it promised. The house existed. The car existed. The television existed. The children were healthy and going to good schools. The future was plausible and probably better than the past. This was not nothing. It was, for many people, nearly everything they had ever asked for. But prosperity is not the same as well-being, and the decade's great operational mistake was treating the gap between them as something that could be managed rather than addressed. The women whose domestic labour produced the gleaming household were not consulted on whether the gleaming household was what they wanted. The consultation had happened at the altar years earlier, under conditions that did not include full information. The black Americans excluded from the prosperity were not footnotes to the story. They were the structural foundation of it, their exclusion the mechanism by which the white middle class accumulated the wealth that defined the decade's success. The veterans carrying the war in their bodies and their nervous systems were handed a house and a job, and a cultural expectation of silence, and the silence was maintained with the same discipline that had kept them functional in combat, because discipline was the only tool available. You live in 1957, and the decade tells you, through every available channel, that you have arrived. The Cold War is managed by people who know what they're doing. The economy is growing. The children are fine. The lawn is mowed. The casserole is in the oven. There is a bomb that could end civilization, but your desk is rated for a certain distance, and the civil defense pamphlets have been read and filed, and the matter is in hand. You've taken your Milltown, you've watched your television, you've attended your church and your neighbourhood association meeting, and your child's school play, and the performance of the normal life is so thorough and so practiced that it becomes, for long stretches, indistinguishable from the actual thing. What leaked through the rock and roll, through the beat poetry, through the Mattachine Society meeting held in a private home on a Tuesday night, through the NAACP legal strategy building methodically toward Brown versus Board, through the women reading Beauvoir and not quite knowing what to do with it yet, was the truth that the performance was costing everyone something, and that the bill was accumulating, and that at some point the amount due would exceed what the decade's management could absorb. The 1960s arrived with a particular force of something that has been held under pressure for a long time. It wasn't a random eruption. It was the 1950s settling accounts, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the counterculture, the anti-war movement. None of them appeared from nowhere. They were assembled, quietly and steadily, in the gaps and margins of the decade that preceded them, by people who were paying attention to the distance between what the 1950s said it was and what it actually was. The lawn was beautiful. The appliances were modern. The decade convinced itself it was fine. And underneath all of it, in the particular way of things that are not fine and know it, the next decade was already being built. And so, here you are. You've made it through a full day in 1952, through the cigarette with your morning coffee, through the casserole that defied description, through the duck and cover drill and the mill town and the television humming in the corner like a second heartbeat. You've sat with the housewife in her gleaming kitchen, with the teenager at the drive-in, with the man in the grey suit on the train home, with the woman who couldn't leave and the woman who finally did. You've heard the rock and roll leaking under the bedroom door and the silence where certain conversations never happened. It was not a simple time. It was a time that called itself simple, which is a different thing entirely. The people who lived through it were not naive, and they were not villains. They were human beings doing what human beings have always done, managing the distance between the world as it was and the world as they needed to believe it could be. They carried a depression and a war into a prosperity that arrived faster than anyone had time to process, and they built the best lives they knew how to build with the tools the culture gave them. Some of those tools were good. Some were instruments of genuine harm dressed up in the language of progress. Most were somewhere in the complicated middle, the way most things are when you look closely enough. What they also did, and this is the part worth holding on to as you drift towards sleep, is hold on. The women who stayed and the women who left. The men who came home and couldn't explain what they'd brought with them. The black Americans who woke up every morning in a country that had decided they were less and showed up anyway and organised and marched and changed the law with their bodies and their courage and their absolute refusal to accept the story they'd been handed. The gay men and women who kept living, kept loving, kept finding each other in the dark corners of a decade that pretended they didn't exist. The teenagers who turned up the volume on something the adults were afraid of because they understood, without having the language for it yet, that the fear was the point. They were all building something, even the ones who didn't know they were building, even the ones who thought they were just getting through the week. So tonight, as you settle into your clean sheets, in a room with central heating and plumbing that works and a phone that connects you to the world from the palm of your hand, maybe spare a quiet thought for the 1950s, not the version on the greeting cards and the nostalgia reels, but the real one, complicated and contradictory and stubbornly, impossibly human. The one where people were afraid and pretended they weren't, where people were unhappy and didn't have the word for it, where people were brave in ways that history took decades to recognize. They were ridiculous and resilient and deeply, recognizably themselves. And whatever they got wrong, and they got quite a lot wrong, they also got up every morning and kept going, which is its own kind of courage, quiet and unheroic and absolutely real. Sleep well, the lawn is mowed, the casserole is cold, and somewhere very softly someone has put on a record and the needle has found the groove, and the music has started.